Welcome back to Face the Nation. We are joined now by the Director of Elections at CBS News, Anthony Salvanto. Anthony, welcome back. Let's start with Bernie Sanders. Why is the math so hard for him?
Well, he points out that he does well in a lot of polls head-to-head against Donald Trump. He's right about that. But in order to get to that general election, he does have a steep hill, which is to say he needs to get about 70% of the remaining pledged delegates that are out there, 90% of all the uncommitted delegates that are out there, in order to catch Hillary Clinton. And that also presumes that Hillary Clinton's support will just evaporate. And so far, it shows no signs of doing that. So it is tough for him.
He talks about maybe convincing the superdelegates when he gets to the convention. He's also got a steep hill to climb there as well.
Yeah, superdelegates are about persuasion, not just about math. And these are party leaders and elected officials who can support whomever they like. And right now, the majority of them are with Hillary Clinton. And again, they haven't shown any signs of switching.
Let's now go to the general election map, that big map. We're just start off with reminding us where things stand in a general election, where the two parties are, what things look like going into the general election.
Sure. Well, as we pivot to the general, you start to look at a collection of states where, and remember, the presidential election is a state-by-state contest, although we will see many national polls, which are useful. This is one state by state. Now, the Democrats have, in recent years, held on to a number of states that add up to slightly more electoral votes than the Republicans have sort of reliably in their corner, which is to say the Democrats do very well along the coasts, New York, California, places with big urban centers, and the Republicans tend to do very well around the South through the Plain states. That's where you start. But in the middle of all of that, in the middle is our number of states. We usually call them battleground states, and we'll track them all. And these are places that are more closely divided, where the partisanship evens out or tends to be close to even between Democrats and Republicans. And of course, many of the times you hear them mentioned, you always hear Ohio and Florida mentioned in that sentence. And so that's why we've started there.
Right. So the election in America really takes place in about a dozen states. It's not a national election. It's really about a dozen states. You looked in Ohio and Florida. So what did you learn?
So one of the things that underpins that entire map, because it does tell a story, is the idea that partisans ultimately come home. They ultimately vote for the nominee of their party. Now, they do that reliably in a lot of those deep blue and deep red states that we mentioned, but the key is, will they come home in some of these battleground states? In Ohio and Florida, we already start to see that, in fact, that they are. So that you get now 8 and 10 Democrats who've decided they're going to vote for Hillary Clinton, and 8 and 10 Republicans, and this is important because they've talked so much about unifying the party, can he unify, who will say now that they will vote for Donald Trump. And importantly, the motivation behind them is not entirely that they think that either of these folks is the best candidate. There's a big part of their motivation that says they're out to stop the other side.
So let me ask you about that in a second. But a lot of people say that Donald Trump will be like Barry Goldwater in 1964, who got crushed by Lyndon Johnson. What you're suggesting is that there is a kind of systemic change in the structure, that Republicans support Republicans. And so Donald Trump is always going to get, barring some calamity, what it appears from your findings so far is that he's getting the kind of normal Republican vote already, despite all the talk of never Trump.
He is. And what you're exactly right about the way this is shaped up historically. Now, you go back to the 60s, you go back to the 70s, even the 80s, and you would see a quarter of partisans switching over to the other side. President Reagan got a quarter of Democrats. And we saw that pattern a lot. But over recent years, it's become much more hard and fast, where partisans, if 6 or 7% of them cross over, that's a big number. So you're right that this is recent, and this is a phenomenon where we see partisans voting for their candidate. And that's right. It does appear now that Donald Trump is going to get many of those Republicans, at least in these battleground states, to start falling into line with the Republican nominee.
One of the arguments Hillary Clinton is making about Donald Trump is that he is risky. What have you found in the polling that tells us about people's tolerance for risk?
Yeah, there may be some. We found that a third of folks say that things are so bad that the country can afford to take a chance on its next presidential pick. And it so happens that Donald Trump is winning, dominating among those voters. Now, That's not everybody, that's a third, and some of those are Republicans and independents who may be looking to rationalize a choice and maybe a controversial one. But the thing is, for Hillary Clinton, she has to watch that that idea does not expand out, that that idea does not take hold in a wider segment of the electorate, because Donald Trump is already leading on the ability to bring change. And so
Republicans have been saying to me, big risk, yes, but maybe big reward. Yep. Let's, on the last question here, we're talking about the map as it's kind of traditionally been in 2012 and so forth. What are the chances that the map could change outside of these battleground states that we're familiar with? What are you looking for in terms of what we should look forward to in terms of the map changing, if it does?
I think it's a good chance. I mean, look, if we've learned anything this year, John, it's that we should challenge our assumptions.
Right? It might be a whole new continent.
Exactly. So what we've got here is we're starting with a map, and what we've seen from partisanship that's based on the last couple of cycles. But you start to look, again, the map tells a story about what kinds of voters each of these candidates can win. And take, for example, Donald Trump, who does very well with white working class voters. Well, if he continues that, as he did in the primaries, and there's some evidence out of these polls that he can, well, then his map could expand. He could put places like Michigan, certainly Pennsylvania, maybe even in Minnesota in play. But then the Democrats push back and they say, well, wait a second, there are states like, say, Georgia that have been reliably Republican. They're having high growth. They have a larger segment of minority voters now. Maybe we can put those states in play. So I think that if demographics is destiny, and that's part of whether or not this is all the case, then we can start to look at maybe a very shifting playing field. And that's one of the big things to watch over the next 6 months.
All right, and we'll have you on to discuss all of that. Anthony, one other thing is we missed the Florida matchup that is in our new poll. That shows that Clinton is at 43 and Trump is at 42. And with that, we'll be right back with our panel. Now for some political analysis. We're joined by Molly Ball of The Atlantic, Ezra Klein of Vox.com, Ramesh Ponnuru of the National Review, and Ed O'Keefe of the Washington Post. We're going to get to the Democratic race in a moment. But Ed, I want to start with you. There's a new Washington Post poll that shows the race is very close. Our battleground tracker showed that too. So what struck you in
So
your
this
poll?
was a national survey, and it puts Donald Trump ahead of Hillary Clinton for the first time, 46% to 44%, a statistical tie in polling terms, but notable that he got ahead. I think the two things that stuck out to me, 48% of Clinton's backers now mainly voting to oppose Trump, while 53% of his supporters are with him to oppose her. So it shows you that this is one of those elections where it's not about that guy, it's about the other person. The other thing that sticks out, I think, throughout this whole thing, if you dive deep into it, 52% of voters right now telling us they want an experienced candidate, while 43% prefer an outsider. That number has tightened, and if it continues to tighten, I think it continues to show the real challenge potentially for Mrs. Clinton, because nobody in this race but her, speaks to the establishment, the experienced sort of type of candidate that people would prefer. If the outsider number continues to decline, it would suggest that Trump will do much better.
That negativity you suggested is coming in this race, no surprise to any of us. But we found in our poll in Ohio and Florida, 7 in 10 people thought the race would not be worthy of the presidency.
Yeah.
Molly, are we surprised by these numbers that it's so close?
Well, I think it has been somewhat surprising. A lot of even Republicans I talk to are surprised that the party has come home to Trump so quickly. And that's really what we're seeing in a lot of these polls. Before Trump won the nomination, there were these hypothetical general election matchups where Clinton was way far ahead of him. And that has tightened up principally because of the coalescing of the Republican Party and the failure to coalesce of the Democratic Party. So I think the real open question is whether once Hillary Clinton does decisively win the Democratic nomination, whether her party comes home to her the way Trump's party has come home to him, which is not necessarily a sure thing.
Ezra, of course, this is a long way off from when we have an actual election, but the way Democrats were talking about Trump's vulnerabilities with women, with younger voters, with voters of color, you would have thought that those would be that you wouldn't have numbers this close so far or right now. Do you feel that way?
So I think the question is one Molly just raised. Are we seeing a period of time right now where Trump has been able to begin consolidating the Republican Party because their primaries ended, but Hillary Clinton has not been able to consolidate the Democratic primary because their primary has not yet ended? There have been a lot of polling showing that Clinton is really sagging right now because Bernie Sanders supporters are so negative on her. The Democratic primary has become more bitter, more angry in its final months. So I think the thing that I'm waiting to see is once that ends, and at some point it will end, do her numbers jump back up when we go back to seeing what we've been seeing for a while, which is a 6-7 point lead for Clinton over Trump in the polls?
Ramesh, does this kick a leg out from under the Never Trump movement, which was already having difficulty? Because one of their arguments is, oh, he's going to get slaughtered in the general election. It's going to be a disaster. But if polls are this close, Donald Trump, he often talks about the polls, will say, hey, I'm already ahead, so let's keep rallying behind me.
I think it undercuts the Never Trump movement in two ways. One, because it shows that he's not a sure loser. Two, because it shows that there isn't necessarily this huge audience of conservatives and Republicans who are dissatisfied with him enough to want to bolt. It helps in another way, though, in that it shows that these are two extremely unpopular candidates, two people that most voters don't like, and so it shows that there is maybe an audience for somebody who's going to be a third-party candidate. That's what the Never Trump folks are going to be clinging to anyway.
But do you think, Ezra, that a third-party candidate? I mean, there are polls that show there's an appetite for one, but an appetite is a lot different than building an organization in the 12 battleground states you need to win, right?
And getting on the ballot and doing all of that work. I think the Post poll, if I'm not wrong, tested what would happen if you put in Mitt Romney as a third-party candidate. And he was running behind Clinton and Trump, but it was, I think, if I remember correctly, around 20%, 22% of the vote.
22%.
So there is potentially appetite, but appetite does not, as you say, move into organization. And the problem for the Never Trump folks is that the immediate effect of that would be to destroy the Republican chances in the election. Because what happens even in that Post poll is that Mitt Romney takes more from Trump, obviously, than he does from Clinton.
Molly, let's switch to, do you want to jump in there?
Although it was actually surprising to me how much he took from Clinton and how little it affected the overall. It did, however, change it from a narrow Trump win to a narrow Clinton win.
The significant, a reasonably significant Clinton win. But yes, you're right about that.
Let's talk about the Democrats here, Molly. How bad is the family fight in the Democratic Party right now?
I think it's gotten a lot worse. I've actually been surprised at the level of acrimony. And you know, the Clinton campaign believes that this is not a significant obstacle for her once we get to the general election, that the part of the reason it's become so acrimonious is that the last sort of hardcore that clings to a losing candidate is always going to be the most ardent and bitter and unable to see reality, perhaps. But it has, you know, we saw with the Nevada convention some really ugly things being hurled at the state chairwoman there by the Bernie Sanders supporters. And I think that shows you that, and you know, going back to this question about do Democrats come home the way Republicans come home, it's actually a different question for Hillary Clinton than that, because so much of Bernie Sanders' support has come from independents in open primaries. So she doesn't have to only bring in his supporters, she doesn't only need to bring home Democrats, but a lot of independents and a lot of young people who may never have voted before, who have been absolutely immune to her charms in this Democratic primary.
Is there anything, Ramesh, that Republicans can exploit from the current tension in the Democratic race?
Well, Donald Trump says he's going to try to appeal to Sanders voters, and I suppose he's going to try to make the kind of, I'm going to shake up the system, just as he's trying to. I agree with him on trade. That's something that he's explicitly said, and where the polling suggests that most voters are very receptive right now to an anti-trade message. I don't know in the end if it's going to cause a large percentage of Sanders voters to vote for Trump, but of course he doesn't need a large percentage.
What about Ramesh's point that these voters
Well,
can?
I think they're very easily, Republicans, going to be able to exploit the fact that now we have a member of the Democratic Party who's running for president saying that the party chairman needs to get out, that she deserves to be primaried, that his supporters are clamoring for him to get involved in other congressional races. You're starting to see now the makings of what began in the Republican Party a few years ago, where they started going after party leaders, they started calling for primaries of prominent members of the party. That very well may be part of what Sanders, or at least his supporters, end up doing in the coming years, and the party may be preparing itself now for a little more of a split than we've seen in the past. And polling continues to show that Trump may pull a double-digit, at least, bit of Sanders' support into his camp as the campaign continues. That would mostly be the disaffected, economically distressed or economically concerned voter. They're out there, and they're out there in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, places where if the map begins to shift, this race will be fought.
Although we have, Ezra, in the most recent CBS News New York Times poll, found that 72% of Sanders voters would vote for Clinton in the general. In May of 2008, only 60% of Clinton supporters said they would support Obama. So the Democratic race, for all of the excitement this week, at least as the polling shows, is not as hot as it was in '08.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing right now, and I agree with Molly, it's gotten more acrimonious, but it is not unusual. I mean, I remember Pumas at the 2008 convention, the Hillary Clinton supporters who would never, under any circumstance, ever support Obama. But of course, he got a very, not just normal, but very healthy share of the Democratic vote once the general election actually went down. And I think you see it with Trump. I mean, you were saying earlier, it's surprising how quickly Trump has consolidated the party. From a place of real acrimony and fear, people talking about third-party runs, what's been going on the Democratic side has had much smaller differences than Trump versus the establishment of the Republican Party. And so it is hard for me to see why it would be a much more difficult gap to bridge.
Okay, we're going to take a little break right now, but we'll be right back with more of Ramesh, Ed, Ezra, and Molly in a moment. And we're back with our panel. Let's switch to talking about the Republicans. Ed, Donald Trump this week released 11 Supreme Court names. He might pick a Supreme Court nominee or two from that, and he also was given the endorsement of the NRA. How does that help him?
This is sort of base maintenance at its best. I mean, he went out there and very quickly settled an issue that had been a big concern to a lot of these Republicans who were skeptical about his conservatism, picking 11 folks who basically passed muster with your audience, I would think. And the NRA endorsement is notable because of what he has said in the past about gun control. He was pretty supportive of restrictions and had tweeted in the past, right after the Newtown tragedy, for example, that the president had spoken for all of the country in the wake of that gun violence. And yet this weekend stands on the stage in Kentucky at the NRA convention and even openly suggests that because she's so anti-gun, perhaps Mrs. Clinton should go without her Secret Service protection. That's exactly what a lot of Republicans want to hear. That's why I think we're beginning to see the consolidation work. And if you think about the last few weeks, he came to Washington, gets the blessing of a lot of congressional leaders. He releases his Supreme Court nominations. He goes to the NRA and gets their blessing. He's even made some pretty half-hearted, but enough to say that he's tried attempts at getting Hispanic voters, or at least Hispanic conservatives. All of this designed to assuage the fears of Republicans that he's incapable of being their nominee.
Ramesh, I've talked to Republicans who are supporting Donald Trump, and I'd say, well, where are you on his ban of new Muslim immigrants? They don't agree with that. They don't agree with the deportation. They don't think he'll build the wall. But does any of that matter if he's got the right opinions on Supreme Court nominees and the Second Amendment?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to, whether it matters. And you got to remember with the ban on Muslims, with the wall, he's also said these are negotiating positions. So a lot of Republicans who don't agree with it can support him anyway because they think, well, that's just campaign rhetoric. What's interesting here is that typically the Republican nominee courts conservatives during the primaries and then broadens the message afterwards. Here you got a guy who's talking about how we're going to please conservatives on the Supreme Court and on guns after he's clinched the nomination, which is a very unusual position for Republicans.
But I think it's fantastic counter-programming at a time when Clinton and Sanders are still fighting with each other. Here he is spending, the 2 months before his convention, consolidating the support, checking all the boxes, going to all these different groups while they're still fighting it out. Again, I think that's part of why we're seeing the support he's now enjoying.
But the last bit he hasn't gotten is the donors. The Republican donors are
and
still
that will
That's
probably
right.
be the hardest of all.
Molly, the New York Times has a piece today and says all the big donors, well, not all, but a lot of the big donors in the Republican Party are not supporting Donald Trump. Is that a problem, or can he get around that somehow?
Well, it is a problem if he will not have the money that he needs to compete in this campaign, although I think what he would say was he didn't have the traditional money or structure for the Republican primary, and that was fine. I mean, I would say a couple things about this. First of all, you're talking about the traditional donor base of the Republican Party, and what Trump is aiming to do is bring in a non-traditional donor base of his friends, who may be sort of eccentric billionaires who haven't been really involved in politics in the past. His finance chairman, Steven Mnuchin, is someone who's given more to Democrats. Trump knows people like Carl Icahn, who said he's going to put $150 million into this election. So there may be a whole new donor base that's available to Trump. Also, the RNC, has been preparing to be the machinery of the nominee's campaign, whoever it is, for the last 4 years, and to do all of the, digital field organizing, all the little stuff that Trump doesn't seem interested in.
The eccentric billionaires pack. It has a ring to it. Ezra, let me ask you about Guy Cecil, who is the head of Priorities USA, the super PAC helping Hillary Clinton, said that calling Donald Trump risky is maybe not such a smart idea because with the notion of risk, is also paired with it the idea that, hey, maybe there's a big reward out there. What do you think about that in terms of Democratic messaging?
So the way the Clinton orbit, which includes parties USA, is trying to think about this election is that there are two ways they think you can win it. One way is that you can try to run a traditional Democratic-Republican election, split the electorate into two groups, and hope yours is a little bit bigger. That's what Obama does in 2012. They think there's a possibility, and maybe that possibility is not real, but they think it might be real, that you can go a bit bigger than that by making Donald Trump unfit for the presidency, that you can somehow convince people that this is not someone who is just fundamentally qualified, which is something you see, by the way, in the post poll. A lot of people believe he's not fundamentally qualified, and if you could do that, then you get a landslide level victory. And so I think the thing they are trying to work through is what are the messages that are the least alienating to those independents and even potentially Republican moderates if they want to pick up. Things like risky, as you say, they might have a downside of potentially saying, well, Donald Trump might be better than you think, but they're trying to work in that group of ideas that are about being unqualified, unfit for the presidency.
Ramesh, Donald Trump met with Henry Kissinger this week to fix, I think, that qualification question, right? What if he lines up 10 of those meetings is seen talking to all, does that help? Does it help with the foreign policy establishment in the conservative side?
I think it helps, but fundamentally it's going to require the candidate himself not just to meet with people, but to sound different when he's talking about issues. I think Ezra's right about what the vulnerability that the polls show. Even when they show Trump ahead, they show a majority of Americans, a majority of registered voters who don't think he has the right temperament to be president, who don't think he's qualified to be president. Now, obviously, based on the overall numbers, not enough people are weighting that concern heavily enough for the Democrats. But what they're going to try to do is get them to weigh it a little bit more heavily.
All right, that's going to have to be the last word. Thanks to all of you. Thanks very much for watching, and we'll be right back. That's it for us today. Thanks for watching. Until next week, for Face the Nation, I'm John Dickerson.